and logic apply just as much in fantasy as they do in reality set books. So setting is more than simply a geographical location or time period that serves as a backdrop to characters' actions. Fictional settings have lots of uses. Place in the story has multiple purposes and effects. The places you set your scenes contribute mood and tone. So for example, a dark, eerie wood creates a very different sense of danger or mystery compared to a bright, open plain of land. Places restrict or open possibilities for your characters' lives and actions. A character living in a small mining town might have very different perceptions and options compared to a character who lives in a large city. And places can evolve and change as your story progresses. You can use their evolution to show the changing circumstances affecting your character's views and options. The important thing to remember about setting is it is as important as character. Setting in a novel is a character in the novel. I'm going to read a couple of things to give you a sense of how this works. So this is the start of a novel. I'm just going to try and share the screen now.
I'm looking. I'm actively looking to fix that.
Just let me know, Debbie, when
does it give you the option to ask me permission to? Does it say ask host?
No, it says host disabled attendee screen sharing.
Okay, cool.
Not
I'll fix it in a sec.
But sometimes it's easier for people to make notes from notes. So, but I'm going to read this. It's by Chris Priestley. It's called Uncle Montague's Tales of Terror. The way to Uncle Montague's house lay through a small wood. The path coiled between the trees like a snake hiding in a thicket. And though the path was not long and the wood not at all large, that part of the journey always seemed to take far longer than I would ever have thought it could. It had become a habit of mine to visit my uncle during the school holidays. I was an only child and my parents were not comfortable around children. My father tried his best, putting his hand on my shoulder and pointing various things out to me. But when he had run out of things to point out, he was overcome with a kind of sullen melancholy and left the house to go shooting alone for hours. I think the beginning, the description of the walk through the wood is a really wonderful and rather spooky start to a novel. It does give you an idea immediately how important setting is. So time is an equally important element of story, of setting. It would be incomplete to answer what is storytelling without including time. Time in a story, for example, the historical period or epoch the story spans, is equally vital. Like place, time, for example, the social attitudes of the 1800s, restricts or rather determines to some extent possibilities for your characters. The time setting of your novel impacts what types of lives your characters can lead and what choices they can make. Characters living in Accra in the 18th century will have very different choices and lifestyles available to them compared to characters living in contemporary Accra. Time in your novel's setting determines what kind of technology is available. Historical fiction often describes old-fashioned tools that most modern readers wouldn't know, and of course the pre-mobile phone internet world. And time in your story setting is equally useful for showing and underscoring changes that contribute to character and plot development. For example, changes of government, scientific discovery, social beliefs and customs. So here are 5 tips on getting these elements of time right, time and setting right. So first of all, research and plan. Sketch a rough map and find out about the architecture, the customs, the flora and the fauna of the place that you want to set your novel. Develop your place like a character. As I said, it's really important for setting the mood of your book. How does setting change, grow or crumble over time? We give characters individual voices to make them feel real, so that the cast members of our novels don't feel like two-dimensional carbon copies of one another. Just like a character, a place in your novel should have its own voice. Write place like you would a character. Create physical descriptions that make the place memorable and distinctive. What is the setting of your story famous for? Are there significant landmarks? Is there a general atmosphere of decay, or is your setting a thriving young village or city? Develop place. How will your setting change over the course of your story? Do characters' actions and choices affect their surroundings and vice versa? How does society as a whole relate to its surroundings? Is there climate change? What effects will time have on place? And how will these affect your characters? So don't just think of your place as a street with houses on either side of the road and traffic running up and down. Think of the cultural context of that street. What's the social economic group of the people like that live there? How do they relate to their neighbors? What's the weather like? What's the mood in the place like? Is there a pandemic? If there's a pandemic, how does that affect your setting? Do people go out? Do people stay in? Do people ignore the rules? Do people abide by them? And think about, if you're setting your novel in a real place, but you don't know that place, it's not really the end of the world, because there's this wonderful thing called Google Maps. And try Google Street View. Walk the paths your characters take. You may be setting your novel in your town, your hometown. But if I was setting a novel in London and I was writing about a part of London I had never visited, I'd really want to visit it, to go and have a look and see what it was like. Find sources in fact and fiction. Use historical accounts, statistics and atlases, books based in similar settings. Writing about a real place you know is risky, but read local government websites, use Google Maps, see if you can get in touch with someone who lives in the places that you're interested in and ask them questions. You can't ask too many questions, you can't research too much. So build your place and time. Think about climate as well as culture, season as well as historical era or period. Think about the ways in which people related at the time. If you're setting something in a historical period, what was the role of women at the time? Were women able to move around as freely as men? Did girls go to school? If you're writing a historical novel and the central character is a girl, but girls weren't able to go to school at that time, don't set the story in a school. Do think about all the detail. When you're writing about a bygone era or a lost civilization, you can't exactly take a Google Street View tour. In that case, borrow from factual books about the lives, art and architecture of your chosen people and time period. If possible, find books written by people who inhabited your chosen place in the time you were writing about. If you're writing about Roman Britain, there's lots of records of life at the time. Medieval London, lots of records. Samuel Pepys' diaries, Shakespeare. There's many ways of getting in to a sense of the time and place, the setting. When archival materials are scarce, you can also rely on the work of good authors who have based their fiction in the same setting. Even if writing about invented settings, look for details and ideas you can borrow from other places. At Pushkin in October, we're publishing a book by a Ghanaian author called Aisha Haruna Attar, called The Deep Blue Between. And this is set in the 1800s in Ghana, at the time called Gold Coast. And the author has researched so impeccably. She's found newspaper articles. She's found out about the women's union at the time. She's found out about the relationship between Ghana and Brazil. She's researched and researched. And the book doesn't read like a nonfiction novel, but what she's done is use that research to allow her to create a very convincing setting in which she's placed her characters.
So I think you can share now.
Oh, thank you. Oh, great. Right. Okay. So setting and research. So Practical things you can do: draw a map of the world, especially if it's imagined, if it's an imagined world. To create a believable setting for your novel, plan each element of setting consciously. So the location, is it a country? Is it a region of a country? Is it a city? Is it a small town? Is it a school? Is it a hospital? Is it a commune? Is it a space station? Have a very specific idea of what it is and get to know it, draw it, think about it, research it. What's the time of year? And this may be seasonal. So for example, Christmas in Dickens' novella, A Christmas Carol. Is it the rainy season? Is it Harmattan? Is it the freezing winter in the North Pole, or is it even the summer in the North Pole? Time of day, when you're writing throughout your novel, elements of setting will change. So for example, the time of day, think about how the time of day in which a scene is set can influence the tone and atmosphere. Nighttime can be more ominous or eerie than daytime. Early morning brings into play other elements of how society is waking up, how people are waking up, and how the world is coming alive. Climate. Think about the natural elements of your setting as well as the man-made ones. Make notes, really make notes and think about things carefully. And make notes and set the scene for each scene before you draft it, so that you can keep these details in mind and use it to furnish your scene with extra vivid detail. It's really important to see your setting as a character. There's a wonderful novel called Witch Child by Celia Rees, and it's set in the 1700s, and it's about a girl whose grandmother is accused of witchcraft, and she runs away to North America in order to save herself. And she turns up in North America at the time of the Puritans arriving in North America, and it's about her in that setting, and it's about the treatment of Native Americans at the time, and it's about a young girl's search for freedom. And reading that novel, you literally are transported back to the time where people went out to pick medicine, and Celia talks about the collecting goldenrod, which is a herb for a certain kind of medical treatment, and she researched all of these things. She knows that that herb would have been used for the treatment that she's using it for in the novel. A book that I talk a lot about is Holes by Louis Sachar. And the opening to this novel is a really wonderful example for setting a scene. And I'm going to read it. There is no lake at Camp Green Lake. There once was a very large lake here, the largest lake in Texas. That was over 100 years ago. Now it is just a dry, flat wasteland. There used to be a town of Green Lake as well. The town shriveled and dried up along with the lake and the people who lived there. During the summer, the daytime temperature hovers around 95 degrees in the shade, if you can find any shade. There's not much shade in a big dry lake. The only trees are 2 old oaks on the eastern edge of the lake. A hammock is stretched between the 2 trees, and a log cabin stands behind that. The campers are forbidden to lie in the hammock. It belongs to the warden. The warden owns the shade. Out on the lake, rattlesnakes and scorpions find shade under rocks and in the holes dug by the campers. I think that's just such a wonderful description of a place that you don't really want to be finding yourself. And the campers are, in fact, young men who have been locked up in a juvenile detention centre. So setting is about authenticity. When setting something historically, it can be exhausting for the reader if there's a lot of information and a lot of detail. It's really helpful to condense that and just include the things that set the tone rather than overwhelm the reader with a sort of ye olde English feel. Don't forget to research, and then use that just to colour in your picture. Don't use that to write your picture. Diaries, people's diaries, which are, and there's so much available online, are wonderful ways of finding out about what things were like in the past, whether that's from the 1950s or the 1850s or even the 1750s. People have always kept diaries. People have written letters to one another. People have talked about things that they're doing. Read other novels set in the same times that you're interested in writing about. Read other historical novels that aren't set in exactly the same place, but read other historical novels for voice. Because while people 200 years ago probably used language in quite a different way to the way we use it now, it might be quite tiring for us as contemporary readers to read a book written entirely in that dialect. But think about how you can use elements of that dialect to help amplify a sense of setting. And as I said earlier on, think about the location, the geography, the climate, the hour, the season. Think about the detail. Do we have any questions for on setting and research? Debbie, while I try to find a way of getting back to a smaller screen. There we are. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you, Sarah.
Do we have any questions? I can't see any.
Yeah, yeah, I have some questions here, so I'll start with that. I guess, would you say that even for like African settings where there might not be as much written records, that it is possible for people to find things like diary entries and letters, etc.? And do you have any like places to point people to?
Well, yes, I think there is a lot actually, and as I said, there's a lot online. So look at the British Library and search through what the British Library holds. But also don't underestimate novels, other people's novels that will help you. So there's a lot of contemporary African literature being written at the moment that's historically set. Aisha's book coming in October. They can give you a sense of the parameters of using historical fiction. And then, of course, there's novels that were written in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, which are available still to read. And while it can be hard to get hold of physical copies often because things are out of print, there's usually an ebook version available that you can read. There's usually something that we can access to get a sense of how other authors have dealt with historical fiction. One of the things about researching historical Africa themes is whose voice are you hearing when you're reading diaries and letters? And often it would be the voice of people visiting the continent, colonial people in colonial authority, or traders, or people who were accompanying their husbands, for example, who were keeping a diary of their time on the continent. And while that isn't an African point of view, often it's possible to read through the preconceptions and I don't want to say entirely prejudice, but often quite prejudiced point of view that people were expressing in those stories. And you can imagine what the person that's being viewed is thinking and feeling. And that can be really helpful to if somebody's describing a town or their trip to a market and describing it in a certain way. Imagine yourself being the person who's being described and think about how that description can be very skewed and one-dimensional, but it will help to give you a kind of a wriggle in to a sense of place. But as I say, libraries, I don't know if when I was in Accra last, I went to that wonderful library behind the park, Debbie. I will remember the name of the library. But they have thousands of books. They have books that have been, they have a huge African collection. And they have
the George Padmore Library, yeah.
Yes, the Padmore Library. And they have a huge collection of books written by Ghanaian authors. And they are literally things like diaries, ledgers, accounts of businesses. There's so much in there. And actually, if you can just get into one of these institutions and start to look through, you're going to find a lot of stuff to read, a lot of stuff that will help you kind of get through and find little nuggets of information. Back to Celia Rees, after which charge she wrote a book called Pirates, about two young women who end up being pirates. There were a lot of female pirates in the 1800s, 17 and 1800s. For all sorts of reasons, and these two young women were pirates, and Celia researched her novel intensely. She looked at sugar plantations in the West Indies, she looked at life in Cape Verde, she looked at all sorts of things, and in her first draft of that novel she wrote in great detail about the process of making sugar, the cutting of the cane, the dragging of the cane down to the factory, the melting, and described in detail the process. And actually, for a reader, it was a bit boring. It was a bit like reading a non-fiction book about the production of sugar in the West Indies in the early 1800s. And I suggested that she just found one detail that would give a sense of how brutally hard that experience was. And she described the heat in the room, the heat. And that was enough to give us a sense of what it would have been like. So while research is a really important thing, it helps you build the picture in your head, but the reader doesn't necessarily need it all. Okay.
Lots more questions and comments, Sarah. There's a comment, and I'd love to hear what you think. Oral history is also important when writing within a setting. Before your time, interview older family members if you're studying your writing when you were a child or just before your birth.
I didn't hear all of that. Sorry, can you read it again, Debbie?
Yes. No, it's in the chat from Firos that oral history is also really important when writing a setting before your time. So you can interview older family members if you're setting your story when you were a child or just before your birth.
Absolutely. And also, one has to remember that the wonderful thing about oral history is how it is passed down generation. And it's so important to listen to people that are older than us and listen to their stories and listen to their stories about their grandparents, because they will have stories from their grandparents that told them about their grandparents. And those stories are real. They're really, really wonderful. I know in Nigeria there's the Oriki, and their praise poems about families. And families have these wonderful narratives which describe the history of the family. And each generation, because the Oriki is a live process, more is added to that story, that family story. Those stories are so important. And thank you so much, the person that mentioned this, because yes, real people, live people can tell us an immense amount about the past, because the past is still with us. We're part of a process, and we mustn't forget to ask people to share their stories with us.
Another question, Sarah. When working with authors, when do you recommend diving into deep research? Right from the jump, during drafting, when editing, secondary drafts, a concern is getting lost in the research and not getting to the end of the text.
I think to a certain extent, you have to have done your research before you start. If you know when you're writing your book and what you're interested in, you start to do your research. And if I'm walking along the River Thames and I see a really old house and I think, oh my goodness, who lived in there? When was it built? Then I would start researching and the story would evolve out of that. it is really important not to be waylaid by research and become, as I mentioned, this thing with the sugar, production of sugar, kind of more anxious to share the research than share the story. Often what will happen is that you'll dip in and out of research. When you've got your first draft, you've written your first draft and somebody reads it and says, oh, I'd love to know a little bit more about this. Then you can start to research that. Or you can read your first draft and think, oh, I've sort of skirted, I've talked about this war in the 1800s, but I don't really know very much about it. Now I have to go back and research and bring in some elements there to make that a convincing story. So yes, on the one, you definitely do need to have a sense of your setting in the first place, but then you have to start writing and not become more anxious about keeping the research going than writing the story, because writing is a process that involves so much back and forth. And you can't really start doing that until you've got a first draft. Once you've got a first draft of a novel, then you can start editing, then you can start thinking, wondering where the holes are and what needs to be built up a little bit more. So
Yeah.
I suppose in a way this goes on all the time.
Yeah, another question, the examples seem to focus on errors from the past. How much research does one have to do if writing in a contemporary period you're familiar with?
Well, I think probably quite a lot, because if you're not, fiction isn't just a straight story about your own life. Fiction is a made up world, even if that's made up in a real world. And so if I was to, reading a story about, from a writer who's university educated, has a job, lives in a beautiful house in a lovely suburb of a big city, but they wanted to write about a group of people who were impoverished and struggling to survive because of global weather changes or the pandemic, for example. I'd want to feel that the author has gone to find out what it's actually like to live in that place, and has a sense of what the actual day-to-day life is like for people in that place, rather than just assumed things about it. There's a book called Boy 87, which we published a couple of years ago, and a white author based here in the UK. She lived in Ethiopia for a long time. And she, when she was in Ethiopia, she was very conscious of the migration issues that were affecting young people from that part of the world. And she wrote a story about a boy called Shif, who's a young Eritrean child who is about to be conscripted into the army, and his mother gets enough money to send him on a journey to the Mediterranean to get on a boat across into Europe and hopefully to safety, away from this risk of being conscripted into the army. Now, Ellie had seen the lives of people, but this isn't her story. So she had to meticulously research this novel so that it felt authentic and kind, and so that it didn't generalize the life of one child and say everybody's life is like this in this country. And she researched and researched and researched. When the route that the child takes in the book is an actual route that somebody could take. She, for a while, the child is imprisoned in a camp in the desert. She used UN satellite film of a camp in a desert that was used as a prison for people, so that she could describe something that was real, and yet it's also a work of fiction. So contemporary set fiction does need as much, perhaps even more careful research, because in a way, who's going to argue with you about something that you say happens in the 1600s? So it's going to be pretty hard to prove. But anything that's happening now in the 2020s, we've got to be really careful to get it right. And then, of course, there's fantasy. And it's not, you're not off the hook with research just because something's fantasy. You've got to think about the world really, really carefully, because you're making it all up. And it has to be as logical and consistent as it would be if you were setting your book in a real world. So the rules have to be there, the social groups have to be consistent, the way in which people relate to one another has to be consistent throughout the novel. And that does also involve research. What's the weather like? Is there a season? How long is a year? If it's in a parallel galaxy, how long is a year? How long is a day? Is a day 2 hours of light or 49 hours of light? What happens? What's it like? How does it work? And that does involve research. Reading a lot of other people's books is a wonderful way of researching how people build fantasy worlds. But it involves you kind of making up the research as well and being very consistent.
Sarah, and how do you do this, but not tell too much, but rather show? That's another question that's coming.
Well, I'm going to read you from Boy 87, something that I think that shows it really well. So this is a description of going to school. All the boys in our class were similar height until summer term. Then suddenly Binny was a bit taller, and now his body seemed to stop shooting upwards. I fixed my eyes on his back, dodging the other kids in their blue uniforms, hopping on and off the dusty curb as I weave round bodies and jump clear of oncoming cars. I see the market up ahead. People and small piles of vegetables spill from the pavement onto the street. Next to some open sacks of cinnamon, Binny is leaning against a jacaranda tree, mouth closed, pretending that he isn't out of breath, even though I can see his chest heaving up and down. So I think that's a wonderful description of two children chasing each other to school, and a sense of the street being a really wonderful, safe, happy place where you can dodge cars and run around the market. Almost the same setting, but sounds very different. The next morning, Mum leaves before I do. Work is busy right now, which is good and bad. My little sister Lem whines as she's bundled out of the house. I hear Mum promising her something nice as the door clicks shut behind them. 2 minutes later, Binny knocks. I grab my bag and we walk down the road to school. Binny slowly, me at normal pace to keep up with his giraffe strides. As we get closer to the school, the roads are wider and the houses become bigger. We're about to turn the final corner when Binny slows down. An army truck is parked about 100 meters from the school entrance. 4 soldiers are sitting in the back, rifles on their knees, watching the school kids pass in front. I look ahead to the gates. No one is kicking a ball around. The other kids are filing into school without looking up. One mother turns around and starts walking back the other way, taking her sons with her. So that, I think, is a wonderful way of showing and not telling. We have a real sense of threat in the second description. And at no point does the author say anybody's scared, anybody's worried. She shows us that by one mother turning around, that the children aren't kicking the ball around in the playground. So description, how you describe things, is a really wonderful way of showing and not telling the reader what is happening. I hope those examples are helpful. Is it possible that some fiction stories are real stories told anonymously so that it does not link to a person or persons? You could, I mean, there's lots of stories that rely on real life and real people as inspiration to write a work of fiction. And I think particularly back to historical, there's lots of ways of finding historical characters who are so fascinating and trying to imagine what their lives were like and building it in a sort of fictional way. So yes, it is possible to use real characters, real people. And you can, if they're famous real people like Queen Amina, or somebody could write a fictional account of Kwame Nkrumah's childhood, for example, you would mention them as real people, or you could read about a real person and distance yourself from them by changing their name. Either works. I just noticed very quickly a question about books flipped past. I am writing a book list, and I will share that but next week, because each week when we're talking, I think of new books to mention, and I'm just making a note and popping it down on the list. We'll share it.
Sarah, there was a question. How does one merge a real setting or place into speculative fiction?
How do we do that? I think that's actually quite fun to do. So, for example, I can think of examples often of films that are set in real places, but after something extraordinary has happened. So you have all the recognizable landmarks of a city that you live in and know. So, for example, Big Ben and London Eye and the Tower Bridge, and yet things that are happening around them aren't normal, regular things that one would expect to see. If I go out this afternoon, what would I expect to see? Buses, people walking around, usually policemen in central London now. Possibly not that many people at the moment because of the pandemic and people aren't really going out. But the general hubbub. But if you set your book in a fantasy world set, say, 150 years into the future, and nothing's quite the same. London's deserted. People have left London. What is roaming the streets of London in that case? Was it animals? Is it people, homeless people who have taken over the centre of the city? The government's moved out. It's no longer safe to be in the city. The government's moved to the countryside where it can be securely protected. So who's living in the city? How are the parks? What are the parks like? I would start to imagine them being overrun with animals, all those animals that have been denied access to the city while there's been so much traffic. And how would people be living? Would they have built their own houses in the parks? Would they have moved into office blocks? So yes, you can use real places to help you use them as a sort of basis to speculative fiction. And actually, I think that's a really exciting thing to do. While making up a setting in speculative fiction is obviously hugely popular, playing with places that people already know terribly well and imagining how those places could be in a changed future is also a really exciting thing to do. Do we have any questions? Debbie, am I still live?
Yes.
Right. I'm sorry, for some reason I'm not seeing the questions, so I'm relying on other
Okay. So do you think that description has to be sacrificed when writing a story with an eye for plot?
No, I don't. I think both can both have a place. That you need to I think if you don't describe enough, your reader isn't grounded. And it is something that as an editor, I'm often asking people to do, is to describe a bit more. Because I can't imagine, if you don't tell me what something looks like, I kind of can't quite imagine. So if you just say, she got up and she left the house and she walked down the street and she got to school, and when she got to school, I'm like, okay, what's her home like? How does she feel waking up? What's the street like? What kind of climate does she live in? What's the journey like? Is it difficult terrain that she's crossing over? Is she walking through the countryside? Is she on a track between fields, or is she on a busy road like a motorway? So I think actually it's a balance. You've got to include enough description for your reader to feel that they're in a real world, but also not to weigh a story down. And I think it's a very interesting balance between enough description to root the reader, but also not so much that it means that you're ploughing your way through great detail and not getting on with the plot. There are, of course, writers whose writing is about description, and it's a very deliberate choice. But I think for young people, generally plot and character are the two things that really engage them, and that somehow those two things have to be driving the narrative. And the setting, the description, the dialogue, all of those stylistic elements have to support plot and character.
Okay, Sarah, there's a question on character, but I'm not sure if you want to dig into that.
Is that what needs to happen to make a character feel like a character?
Yeah.
Well, we talked about character a bit last week, and I think what has to happen to make a character feel like a character that one cares about is that they have to be multidimensional. They have to be complex enough to be real. I mean, we all know what our friends are like, and hopefully we can be honest enough about ourselves to know that we're sort of slightly contradictory and possibly rather difficult people to be around sometimes if we're in a bad mood or being impatient. So your characters have to have all the sides of real human beings. But what has to happen to make the character feel like a real character, I think, is that they have to engage with all the elements of your story. So they have to be complex. They have to speak in a way that's convincing. They have to have real relationships. They have to interrelate with their setting in a convincing and authentic way. And it's a lot of writing, and it's a lot of practice, and it's a lot of self-editing as time goes on. Okay, so it's almost 11, so we can move on to dialogue. Let me see if I can, am I still screen sharing?
Yes.
I am. Ah, cool. Let me get rid of this box then. Go away box. Right, dialogue. So dialogue is really tricky, I'm afraid. There's nothing to say about it other than that it is really hard. It's also one of the most important things in the book because it gives us insight into the minds of the characters, and it's a really important way of giving information to the reader. It can also fail miserably on various counts. It can fail when it feels too wooden. It can fail when there's too much of it. It can fail when it's used to tell the reader something that they already know, that we already know because of the plot and the telling of the story. And it can fail because it's just there for the sake of having a conversation, for the sake of two characters interrelating. Always think about who is saying what and ask why they are saying it. Characters should move the plot forward. As we talk about this, I'm going to read some examples of how that works, because it's quite a hard thing to understand, but dialogue shouldn't be used to tell and retell things that you already know. It should always be used in order to advance the plot. Avoid having characters saying the same things over and over and repeating things to one another. But use dialogue to tell us something we don't know, and it should be related to the character's goals and conflicts. And dialogue is also a really good way of showing character, habits of speech. Is someone bossy? Are they timid? Are they assertive? Are they lying? Are they lazy? Revelations through dialogue, memories, anecdotes, etc. help us get an idea of who a character is and what motivates them. So dialogue is a really important element of a book, but it's a tricky one to get right. So first of all, a few suggestions on how to help polish dialogue is just let it flow. When you write a first draft of a scene, just let the dialogue flow, just write what you feel. And this technique will allow you to come up with lines you never would have thought of if you tried to get it right the first time. Record what your characters are arguing about, stewing over and revealing. Write it all as fast as you can. As you do, pay no attention to attributes, and that is who said, she said, he said, James said, Sarah said. Just write the lines. And once you get these on the page, you'll have a good idea of what the scene is all about. And then you go back and write the narrative and polish the dialogue and think about how it all fits into the scene. And also add things like the tags. Act it out, say it aloud, read it aloud, play the part of each character, give yourself time to come up with a response in each character's voice. And sometimes that can take a couple of days. You know how it is when you've had a conversation with somebody and somebody said something that's annoyed you and you've kind of been a bit feeble in your response. And after 2 days afterwards, you think, oh God, if only I'd thought of. Well, that's the same with writing dialogue in a book. You just need time. There's no rush. Take time, think about it, go back and adapt it. Sidestep the obvious. One of the most common mistakes with dialogue is creating a simple back and forth, a ping pong match. Each line responds directly to the previous line, often repeating a word or phrase. We call that an echo. It goes something like this. Hello, Mary. Hi, Sylvia. My, that's a wonderful outfit you're wearing. Outfit? You mean this old thing? Old thing? It looks practically new. It's not new, but thank you for saying so. There's no surprises there. And the reader drifts along with interest, if indeed they keep reading at all. We have to remember we're writing for children and they are ruthless. They give it up within about 2 lines if it doesn't engage them. And while some direct response is fine, your dialogue will be stronger if you sidestep the obvious. Hello, Mary. Sylvia, I didn't see you. My, that's a wonderful outfit you're wearing. Oh, I can't remember where I left my homework. You can also sidestep with a question. Hello, Mary. Sylvia, I didn't see you. My, that's a wonderful outfit you're wearing. Where is he, Sylvia? So, who is he? And why would Sylvia know? The point is there are innumerable directions in which the sidestep technique can work. Cultivate silence. Sometimes dialogue is also about saying nothing. It gives a very good insight into the mood of one of the speakers. So another example. Should we have another drink? All right. The warm wind blew the bead curtain against the table. The water's nice and cool, Ian said. It's lovely, the girl said. It's really a simple thing, Jane, the boy said. It's not really sneaking out. The girl looked at the ground the table legs rested on. I know you can do it, Jane. It's really not anything. It's just leaving a little earlier than usual. The girl did not say anything. So in this story, the boy is trying to convince the girl to sneak out of the house against her parents' wishes, but Jane doesn't have anything to say about it. Her silence is reaction enough. We know she doesn't want to do it, but is she going to get talked into it? It's quite an intriguing piece of dialogue in this case. Let me find you some other bits to read. So here's another bit from Boy 87. How was the test? Mum asks cheerfully as she walks in with Lem Lem. I look up from my homework. I haven't really done any of it. I can't concentrate. It's like my brain doesn't come to life without Binny there to irritate me. It was mostly easy, just one question I wasn't sure about. I'm sure you will get top marks, she says, kissing me on the top of my head. Maybe this time I will, I answer. She looks at me quizzically. She doesn't like it when I'm not open with her, I realise. I eat dinner mechanically, not thinking about the food in front of me. I'm able to think only of Binny's mother's words. Binny won't be coming to school anymore. This is a massive deal, yet she seemed unmoved, normal, like Mum saying, dinner was ready, just please step over the meteorite which landed in the house. I haven't had a chance to sweep it up. So again, we've got the wonderful introduction to the dilemmas of a young person without us being told that directly that he's worrying. She uses language and she uses dialogue and description and setting really well to set that mood. So polish your gems, work and rework your dialogue. read it aloud, think about the tags, don't use exclamation points unless entirely needed. Don't use adverbs to emphasize a point. Don't say, she said angrily, he laughed nervously. Show us how people feel by how they use their bodies, the words they use to respond, their silences, what they're looking at. Use description, back to the earlier question about description. Use description of the scene to help set the conversation. If somebody's being talked to, if a teacher's talking to a young person and telling that young person off for something that the young person doesn't feel they did, where's the person looking? Is she looking out at the window? Is she looking at the feet? Is she staring defiantly at the teacher? All of that really changes the context of what's being said and how it's being said. Employ confrontation. Many writers struggle with exposition in their novels. Often they heap it on in large chunks of straight narrative. Backstory, what happens before the novel opens, is especially troublesome. How can we give the essentials and avoid a mere information drop? You can use dialogue. First, create a tension-filled scene, usually between two characters. Get them arguing and confronting one another. Then have the information appear in the natural course of things. Here's the clunky way to do it. David Riverford was a new boy in school, having been expelled from his old school for bullying. Instead, place this backstory in a scene in which David is confronted by someone who knows him through a mutual friend. So you can either just say it, he's been expelled from his old school from bullying and he's a new boy, or you can have this kind of conversation. I know who you are, Charles said. You know nothing, David said. You're the new boy. If you don't mind, from Hopkins School. You got in trouble for fighting. Yeah, that's it. So immediately you can see how dialogue can really play a very important part in setting the tone of a novel. We talked earlier on about how to use characteristics in dialogue to help establish a character. So you could have a character who stutters, or a character who is afraid to express themselves, who makes everything sound like a question, slightly pleading. You can use mannerisms of speech to help set the mood of a character. And then, of course, if your story arc is about a timid child learning courage and discovering in themselves the ability to withstand a bully, to stand up to a bully, you can show the way in which they use language, the way that they speak can change, and you can show them becoming more assertive and powerful and dominant through the way they use language and how they speak to their friends. Some people say it's really helpful to listen to dialogue a lot, to listen to people talking to each other and to make notes. And I think that is really helpful. But I think it's also really important to remember that the way that we read things can't include everything that we hear, because it has to be slightly condensed. So that while that's a very useful trick, and you can often hear really wonderful turns of phrases that you can use in a book, it's not enough to report verbatim a conversation that you've overheard. Drop words. This is a favorite technique of dialogue master Elmore Leonard, who's a writer, an adult writer whose work I just think is fantastic. By excising a single word here and there, it sounds like real speech, though it's really nothing of the sort. All of Leonard's dialogues contributes to characterization and story. So here is a standard exchange. Your dog was killed. Your dog was killed? Yes, run over by a car. What did you call it? It was a she. I called her Tuffy. This is what Leonard did in Out of Sight. Your dog was killed? Got run over by a car. What did you call it? Was a she, named Tuffy. It sounds so natural, yet it's lean and meaningful. Notice it's all a matter of a few words dropped, leaving a feeling of real speech. As with any technique, there's always a danger of overdoing it, so pick your spots and your characters with careful precision. I think that writing dialogue between children when we're adults even when we have our own children that we can listen to, is tricky to get a very authentic voice. I suspect that our own children speak to us differently to the way that they speak to their friends, for example. And of course, what children want in a book is dialogue that sounds authentic to them. So it is really helpful to eavesdrop on the way that people speak to one another in a kind of natural and unself-conscious way. But it is important as well not to just, as I say, just report it verbatim. And to think about words like the slang words that people use and the expressions that people use. Those change a lot. They change. Young people's use of slang and phrases, they move in and out of popularity very, very quickly. And that's important to remember as well when you're writing your dialogue in your novels. In 5 years' time, a turn of phrase that's very popular now possibly won't mean anything to a young person. So it's important to balance the use of contemporary dialogue with something that you hope in a few years' time, when your book's still for sale, people will still understand what's being said. Show, don't tell. This is the really hard one. So here's another example. Nell, I hold you and your constant use of social media responsible for the collapse of our friendship. Or, Nell didn't look up from her phone as she said, I need to post this picture of me from last night. Hold on a minute. Jane got up to leave the table. Sure. You better make sure everyone knows what you've been doing. She walked out of the room. So you again, don't state things explicitly. Try to find ways of showing what's going on and use dialogue to show that, show reaction and feeling. Beware of exclamations. Be careful with the exclaiming, sighing, laughing, shouting. Show emphasis through the choice of words and through body language, rather and through action, rather than telling the reader what they are meant to feel from what's going on. So a couple more examples. I will not go with you, he shouted angrily. I will not go with you, he said as he stood up, pushing the chair to the floor. Happily, sadly, angrily, etc. They're all ways of telling us what's being felt and what people are doing, and not showing us. And again, I think the most impactful fiction is the fiction that shows us, and that we can decode through people's behavior and how they're talking to one another. Too much tagging. I know this is a tricky one, but we don't need to say, John said, Sarah said, John said, Sarah said, Sarah said, Sarah said, John, because in a conversation, you can have 4 or 5 statements and follow who's talking before you have to introduce a tag again. He said, she said. So play with that quite a lot. Try taking it out and seeing if you can tell who's speaking from what's being said, rather than having to tell us who's speaking. I think with dialogue, less is always more. Keep it brief. It shouldn't go on for pages and pages. It shouldn't go on for great long paragraphs. That it becomes really tiring reading, batting back and forth conversation between characters. We want to have description. We want to have the author, the voice of the novel, telling us what's going on. The pace of a book is very importantly maintained by the way in which we balance how much dialogue, how much description, and how we balance that throughout the book is what keeps the reader involved. Alternatively, of course, too much description of setting and time and place is also kind of tiring, and it can be slow too. So as I say, it really is a balancing act. So dialogue can also create suspense, and characters can say something that we, the reader, knows to be a lie, or not tell the person they're talking to something really important we, the reader, knows has happened. And that creates a suspense. You immediately wonder, why is this character not telling the truth? Why is this character withholding this information? It can also help reinforce the power balance between characters. When characters are withholding things in dialogue that we, the readers, know are happening, it helps state who in a group of friends has the upper hand, who needs to be challenged, who's going to be the challenger. And I touched on this a little bit earlier on, but dialogue is also a really wonderful indication of relationships, how a child speaks to their mother, how a young person speaks to a teacher, how they speak to a friend, how they speak to somebody that they may feel that they don't have to worry about socially or care about very much. If the child is from a very privileged background, very wealthy background, and they meet somebody who they feel is their kind of social inferior, how do they speak to them? And all of those things help to build a sense of character. If you, I'm going to do some writing exercises at the end, but if you think about that in terms of things that you can write, think about arriving at a market and there's a young person who's offering to help carry their shopping for them. They're with their mother, perhaps the first child is with their mother, and the child is saying, I'll carry your shopping, and it is expecting some money in return. Immediately we've got a social distance being shown to us between these characters. So how does the child speak, one child speak to the other? And think about it from both perspectives, because they're both strangers to one another, and they both need to engage with one another. And how do they do it? And perhaps one will find it easier to use a certain tone of voice than another. So dialogue needs to have a point. It has to move the story along. It has to reflect a character's inner character and conflicts. It can expose secrets, goals, and wounds. And often in dialogue, it's not what's said that's important, it's what's not said that's important. So dialogue contains differing points of view. When two people are conversing, their dialogue needs to reflect their characters and show that they are at odds with totally different motivations. This is what makes dialogue interesting. We've had those examples earlier on of just batting the same thing back and forth, and they were boring examples. Dialogue has more content than ordinary conversation. It's all about context. Use juicy verbs, edit superfluous words, and keep sentences simple. Reveal complex characters with simplicity. Again, often what's not said that is most important and revealing. Most real speech contains fragments, ums and ahs and idioms. Don't include these. Don't have your character say something unless it's pertinent to the story or character. Sorry, sip of water. Avoid monologues. This is as true in dialogue as it is in life. Readers will get bored. Break long bouts of dialogue with some action. Get a character to pour tea or clean out an ear or rub their face or stroke a dog. Show a character's lack of self-understanding in his or her dialogue. Dig into the subtext of the dialogue and try to figure out what it is that you as the author knows, but that the character doesn't know about him or herself. Don't try and explain things in dialogue. None of us like listening to the know-it-all person who has to explain everything along the way. Don't let your dialogue or characters be that person, unless, of course, it's their character. Let the reader have some fun and try and figure it out by themselves. I think one of the most important things to remember about readers is that they remember everything, and that some tiny thing that you say on the first page about a lost handbag And as the plot evolves, and you realise that what's been lost in that handbag is a key to a door in which somebody is locked. Somebody has locked a precious jewel. You don't need to keep referring back to the lost handbag. Just the one mention of it will be enough for people to remember. Use dialogue to create tension. Dialogue is a great way to show characters in crisis, which in turn shows the characters' true colours. There are several ways to create tension in writing, and dialogue is one of the better ones. Mix up the speech patterns of different characters. One character might talk in long sentences, another one use one-word answers. Listen to people around you and try and pick up ideas for differing ways people speak in dialogue. This will make your overall text much more interesting to read and help to differentiate your characters. Study the rhythms and repetitions of authors you admire. The best often repeat words or sounds and use rhythms and patterns to give dialogue interest. Keep dialogue tags simple and use sparingly. He said is perfectly fine. Don't try and convey meaning in a dialogue by writing, he said sadly, he said angrily, she said laughingly. Make your dialogue convey the character's sadness. Also, you don't need to say he said, she said with every sentence of dialogue. It's clear to the reader who's speaking. Take out the extra ones. So some more dialogue, example of dialogue from Holes by Lewis Sacca. This is where you found it? Yes, ma'am. Your good work will be rewarded. She turned to Mr. Pendanski. Drive X-ray back to camp. Let him take a double shower and give him some clean clothes. But first, I want you to fill everyone's canteen. I just filled them a while ago, said Mr. Pendanski. The warden stared at him. Excuse me, she said. Her voice was soft. I had just filled them when Rex... Excuse me, the warden said again. Did I ask you when you last filled them? No, but it's just, excuse me. Mr. Pendanski stopped talking. The warden wiggled her finger for him to come to her. It's hot, and it's only going to get hotter, she said. Now, these fine boys have been working hard. Don't you think it might be possible that they might have taken a drink since you last filled their canteens? Mr. Pendanski said nothing. The warden turned to Stanley. Caveman, will you come here, please? Stanley was surprised she knew his name. He had never seen her. Until she stepped out of the truck, he didn't even know the warden was a woman. He nervously went forward. Mr. Pendanski and I have been having a discussion. Have you taken a drink since Mr. Pendanski last filled your canteen? Stanley didn't want to cause any trouble for Mr. Pendanski. I still got plenty left, he said. Excuse me? He stopped. I drank some. Thank you. May I see your canteen, please? Stanley handed it to her. Her fingernails were painted dark red. You know, it's just such a wonderful piece of dialogue, and the way that the author has included so much tension, so much stress, and the way in which the warden has, the way she repeats, excuse me. I mean, after you've heard that a couple of times, you know, if you hear that, you've said something that she really doesn't want to hear. It's a brilliant. He employs all of the things that we've been talking about tension, where people are standing, what they're doing, what they're looking at, to really help create a wonderful sense of tension. So another good piece of dialogue which sets tone, I think, and shows two very differing moods of people. It's from Boy 87 by Ellie Fountain again. She looks up at me and smiles. When will they tell you your results, she asks. Next week, Mum. Binny has quit. Sorry, I'm going to start again. She looks up at me and smiles. When will they tell you your results, she asks. Next week. Mum, Binny has quit school. She looks down at her sewing, concentrating, even though I know she could sew with her eyes shut. He's top of the class. She is silent. I feel the anger grow once more. This time it is sudden, like a flame on paper. Why would Saba take him out of school? I mean, is school dangerous now too? The words remind me of what Kidane said to us during lunch break yesterday. Someone at school, one of the other kids, said Binny's dad was dangerous. I think he was talking about Dad too. Why would he say that? Is there something else I have to be careful about? What is it this time? If Dad hadn't died, then perhaps I could have asked him. Perhaps he would have talked to me instead of ignoring me. I'm almost shouting now, and Mum leaps out of her chair and puts her hand over my mouth. Her hand smells like new fabric. Don't wake Lemlem, she says softly. But I know it's not Lemlem she's worried about disturbing. It's our neighbours. Anyone on the street who isn't Binny or his mother. The only people we can trust. My mother sits back down. I can tell that she is organising her thoughts. Her response will be calm and orderly. The exact opposite of my questions. She will start by telling me that it's part of living in a big city, that she grew up in a village, but in big cities you cannot trust people in the same way. But she doesn't say that. She says, Shif, your father isn't dead. So again, the wonderful use of silence, the wonderful use of action and physicality to help set a mood, and the way in which the expression of one person is quite different to that of another really helps establish how different these characters are. And I think that might be it for dialogue. So the things to remember, dialogue is really, really hard to get right. Take your time, be prepared to work hard, edit, but don't edit until after you've written everything. Don't edit, as I said last week, don't edit as you go along. It becomes, then editing becomes the job, not writing. So write your first draft and then you start to edit. Act it out, read it aloud, listen to it. And something I mentioned last week, which I think is very relevant with this as well, is when you are reading it, you can record it and leave it and then listen to it back, because actually often it's really difficult to hear ourselves, but if you can hear yourself outside yourself, it helps a lot. Sidestep the obvious. It's more exciting for the reader. It helps create more dynamic characters. It creates a richer fictional world. Avoid monologues. They're really boring unless you're deliberately trying to create the impression of a rather boring character or an overbearing character, a difficult character. But even then, possibly that character shouldn't be monologuing too much of the time. Don't write a play if you want to write a novel. Balance the amount of dialogue versus the rest of the other elements of the story. Pages and pages and pages of dialogue can be really exhausting. There's something about the pace that's set up through dialogue that just you need to be grounded and rooted every so often with description, with setting, and it's about the balance. And again, that's something that you sort out in editing. You sort out second, third, fourth edit as you go along. So, any more questions?
Yes, we have quite a few, and
Great.
please do send in your questions for this bit on dialogue. So, how does one strike a balance between authentic dialogue for children when it involves expressions of ugh and and other modified single words such as duh, and even silence and when not to?
I think it's really important to include all of those things, because I think it helps build a sense of character for the child. If the child isn't very eloquent, or if the child is frustrated and afraid to talk, or if the child is not encouraged to express itself, then you use all of those sounds. I think it's it's all in the telling, it's all in the doing. When you've done it, when you've read it, you'll know if it's too much or if it's too little, if you're establishing a character or if it's becoming a repetitive sound which isn't refreshing or exciting for the reader anymore. I think it's again, it's about striving for authenticity. It's about listening to other people, thinking what it sounds like when you hear it, and then also realizing what it sounds like when you read it, because as I said before, it's often quite different. Not all the ums and ahs and thinking pauses that I have shared for the last hour and a half. If you wrote all of that down, you'd think, oh my God, this is so tedious, I can't read this. So you prune out quite a lot, but still would try to find ways of showing the points at which I'm thinking, and when I'm repeating myself, why I'm repeating things. I don't know if that's helpful.
Okay, go.
Verisimilitude. The appearance of being true or real. It's the detail. I think it's in the detail. I am thinking about things that I've read. It's about not having contradictions in the story that you're trying to tell that will interrupt the way one is able to believe the narrative. So if you're setting, if your hero's too much of a goodie, if your baddie, your antagonist is too much of a baddie, if your social setting is too perfect without the normal stresses and strains that we all feel, I think that makes it harder for us to believe the elements of the story. It's about consistency. It's about the detail not jarring with other elements of the story. So for example, in The Deep Blue Between, the author's research and understanding of the period, the late 1800s, in Accra and Lagos and Salvador in Brazil. She's read newspapers. She describes the houses that people live in. She describes how people move around and how they walk from place to place, or they use a tram, or so she's included the detail that makes us feel confident that we're in a real place. I mean, in the end, I think it really does come down to the way in which you construct your world, the rules that you create, and that you don't break those rules. So if you're creating a fantasy world in which there's issues to do with water supply, and there's wars raging about control of water because there's so little water around, and yet all the characters go home and run themselves deep baths and drink endless glasses of water and leave the tap running while they're filling bottles and so on and so forth, your reader's going to think, how hard is it to get water then? So it's details like that, I think, that really help build an authentic sense of place in a book. Any tips on approaching multilingual character spaces like much of the continent, especially in dialogue? This is a great question, because for all of us, wherever we live in places where we're surrounded by people who speak different languages, and also use the predominant language in quite a different way. If I go out this afternoon into a certain part of London, I will hear English being spoken in a very different way to 5 miles up the road in another part of London where people would use English in such a different way. And we, in our books, in order to make the characters feel authentic and the worlds feel real, we do need to reflect that. If we want to include foreign words in what we're writing, we can either have a direct translation afterwards by example. So if something, for example, if somebody's speaking in Portuguese and they want to say, oh, it's such a beautiful day, they could say, que beleza. And the reader may not know what that means, but the person they're speaking to could reflect the words in a way that points the reader to understand the context. I personally would find it hard to read a book which meant that I had to keep going away to a dictionary to find, or Google Translate to find out what was going on, because that would break the flow of it for me. But there are ways of using foreign words in a context that the context shows the reader what the word means. I think it is possible to do it. Editing this book actually was interesting in terms of different languages, because of course the setting of the novel it's such a huge geographical setting. It's all the way from northern Ghana down to Lagos, so through various language groups, and across to Brazil, where people spoke Portuguese, as well as the African languages of people that had been taken there. And one of the things that I talked about with the author was, how do we do that? How do we deal with that? And one of the girls in this book is one of the characters is the girl that makes the widest movement through all these different language groups. And we wanted to acknowledge the fact that there were so many different languages and that not everybody was speaking the same language. And right at the very beginning, Aisha said that this girl was particularly adept at learning languages because she wanted to know, always to have a sense of what was going on around her. And she knew very quickly that the way that she had some control over that was to understand what people said to each other. So she made a real effort wherever she was to understand the language. So it became a character trait. It became an example of the agency of this young woman. And that was very important. And so including Portuguese words, which we have done in the book, we've included words that are easily explained through people's actions and things that are going on around them. And we've also included words that are about culture. So there's words like candomblé and terreiro, which is the area in which people practice candomblé religion. And we haven't said in the book, the author hasn't said what those words are. When somebody's reading the book, because of the context of the use of that word, it's really clear what it is. Or if you want a fuller explanation, then the reader can go off and find out, look in a dictionary, Google it to find out what exactly those words mean. So there's a whole range of ways of doing it. And I suppose in the end, it's just about choosing the primary language in which you want to write, and bringing the other ones to show diversity and range. What is the difference between conversation and dialogue? Well, nothing really. It's the same thing, I think. It's the exchange of words between characters in the book. While I could go out on the pavement this afternoon and chat with my neighbour for 10 minutes about the nice weather, and that would feel like a really nice thing that I have done, because it's good to be talking to people and sharing things with people. I wouldn't want to read a 10-minute conversation in a book about weather, although I probably would enjoy knowing that that conversation had been had, because it would show that the two people in the book were relating to each other nicely. So you would really condense it down to a quick exchange as two people passed each other. And we talked a little bit about that, is keeping it tight, making sure we're not using too many words. What else have we got, Debbie? How do you deal with the detailed memory you want to share via dialogue without it being a monologue? Do flashbacks help? Or is a monologue acceptable at the right moment? Yes, a monologue is acceptable at the right moment. As I said, I think everything has its place. It's all about putting things in the right place and not overusing things. And flashbacks are really helpful to give a sense of something that's happened in the past. But they can be quite hard to integrate in a natural way. How does the reader know that they're moving out of this story into another story that is going to be important to help the understanding of this story that we're in? And dialogue can be a fantastic way of sharing information from the past. But again, as you know, as we talked about, it's important for it not to be a information dump. So when somebody is remembering something in the past, it has to be in a relevant context. You have to sort of massage it in well so that it's logical that it's there, rather than just an opportunity for you, the author, to state something that's quite important. You have to build a scene around it. Do we have any other questions? I can't seem to roll over the...
So did you...
I can't open up the questions. Sorry, Debbie. For some reason, I don't want to quit the screen sharing because the writing exercise.
Okay, cool. All right. How's a recalcitrant teenager who's practicing the lies he's going to tell the principal in front of a mirror differ from a monologue?
It's different from a monologue in how you tell it. That's all. So I love the idea of the teenager practicing what they're going to do when they get to school, and how they're going to try to clear their name or get themselves out of something they don't want to do. So you could show that, but then what you wouldn't do was showing them do it all again when they get to school. You would tell us they did it when they got to school in a way that by seeing them go into the classroom and then come out successfully or something. So then you would know that it had worked, that all of that practicing had helped them polish their game sufficiently to get away with whatever it is they're wanting to get away with. I think the thing about the sort of good monologue and bad monologue, I suppose, and bad monologue just rambles on and on and on, and you're just bored. And good monologue is a quick, snappy. I think monologue implies just something that's really long, and the child practicing in front of the mirror probably shouldn't be very long. It should be informative. I can see a bit of a question, which is, what is your advice on writing dialogue in languages like Pidgin, or about showing the speech behavior of characters with poor English? I love reading books in which people speak in broken or Pidgin or or slang, or because it shows the dynamic nature of the language and the ways in which people communicate. I mentioned last week a book called Burma Boy, I don't know if anybody's read that, but it's written by a Nigerian author, and it's about, I think, his grandfather rather than his father, but I can't remember now, and his time in Burma during the Second World War, fighting against the Japanese. And it's all written in Pidgin English, and it's absolutely fantastic. And for somebody who's heard a bit of Pidgin English, but is by far not in any way fluent in it, I started reading carefully, and I got into the sound of the voice, and I started to understand through the use of the words being used again and again what was being said. And I just love that book. It's so brilliant, and the whole book is written in Pidgin English. So absolutely go for it, do it. Consistency, brevity, all of those things that we've talked about are just as important, but people will work it out. We've just published a book here in the UK called Bearmouth, which I'm looking around my desk and I can't see, and it's been doing incredibly well. It's won a really big prize. It's selling very well, and it's written in the first person from the point of view of a young person, a teenager, about 13 years old, who is just learning to read and write. And it's being written almost sort of a little bit like a diary. And because this character's learning to read and write, they can't spell. So it's all written in made up spelling that this young person is making up the words. So nothing is spelt correctly. Barely anything is spelt correctly. So when you start reading, you're like, oh my goodness, what is this? And then you get into the being able to read you have to read it phonetically in order to get to really understand what's going on. It's also written in dialect, a really heavy dialect. There's a part of the country here where there's a lot of mining in England, and there's a very heavy dialect that people in that region of the country speak in. So not only is this voice the voice of a child who's learning to read and write, it's also the voice of somebody who's actually not using classical English. And it is absolutely wonderful book. It's called Bearmouth, and it is available as an ebook if you can't get a physical copy. And you have to just go with the voice, but there's no explanation, there's no translation, you just get it. And it's so brave and courageous to do it. And the world needs more of books like that. We have to, as writers, have the courage to know that those voices and that expression has a place in the world of literature.
Okay. What makes dialogue memorable? I'm not sure if you touched on that already.
I think all of the things that we've talked about make dialogue memorable, really. Shorter, snappier, clearer, not too much of it, not telling us things that we can't see in other ways, not retelling the story. How would dialogue play out in reserved cultures where open conflict or bluntness is frowned upon? Is there a way to insert social cues without directly explaining to the reader what is actually happening in the scene where the mood appears calm and friendly? Absolutely. I mean, I think that piece that I read from Boy 87 of the child trying to find out from his mother what's happened to his friend, why his friend has left school, and the mother not saying anything, and then jumping up to tell him, you know, not to speak, not to be so loud. I think absolutely. And in fact, the lovely thing about having words say one thing and actions say another, that wonderful conflict in the discourse is a really powerful thing that can be done with dialogue. I love the idea of a child who's very frustrated and struggling to express themselves because their expression is not encouraged or is seen as rude to an older person, trying to find ways working around the social restrictions on it as a young person. So I think there's lots of really fun things that can be done there.
Okay. What checks can you use to ensure as a writer you're being consistent with the age group you're writing for?
Well, there's two answers to this. The first answer is that some of the most famous and successful children's authors in the world say they don't write for children, they write a story that children happen to enjoy. They're not consciously thinking, I need to use language like this, I need to create a story like that, because this child is going to be 8 and they're not going to, we have to kind of manage and control the information that's getting to that child. They write the story they want to write, and the child then finds the book. And I'm kind of that school of thinking. I think that children are very sophisticated readers, and they love complexity and sophistication and rich concepts. I suppose the thing is that what you don't do is tell them about things that are so beyond their experience that it will mean nothing to them. I mean, I wouldn't write a book for a 7 or 8-year-old about trying to pass my driving test, because they'd be like, why do I even want to know about this? What does this mean to me? So it's about reflecting the kinds of experiences that a child would have in the world, the fictional world that you're creating, remembering that a young person does know about trust, does know about self-expression, does have a sense of betrayal, does understand what it's like for your friends to let you down, as well as for your friends to really stand by you, does understand love and commitment and supports, and those can all be reflected in a novel, but you reflect them in the novel for the young person through examples that the young person could have experienced themselves. Oh, well, I love the idea of being able to speak your dialogue hidden behind your mask. Thank you, Patrick. Good things about the pandemic. You can be having a nice little chat to yourself without anybody seeing you. But and the core of it, which is so good, is yes, practice the words. Say the words aloud. How do they sound? How do they feel coming out of your mouth? Do they sound real or staged? Do they sound kind of arch and practiced, or do they sound natural? And actually saying them is really, really a good way of realizing whether or not your dialogue has a natural feel to it. I'm not sure if I answered this about writing different languages in the same story as would occur in an African story. I'm all for it. But again, it is a case of if you have great long passages of conversation between characters in different languages, and not everybody's going to understand. It's about how you pick certain words and show certain. I mean, one thing is greetings. How you could indicate that somebody is speaking a different language to another person by using a different greeting. So in English, we would say hello, and in Portuguese, you'd say bom dia, and in Yoruba, you would say something else, and in Twi, you would say something else. But for the reader, it'd be really clear, because of the context in which that word is being used, that it's a greeting. And you would then, by having a character use a certain language group greeting, you would immediately show them as being a different group to this other group. So it's using simple words and allowing them to carry the weight of the difference. So it's 5 to 12. And I'm going to now look at some writing exercises. And I'm going to try and get rid of this box, which I'm not sure how I'm going to do that. Let me just click this. So sorry. This isn't actually the one I want to show you, it's this one. So setting and research. The idea really here is to practice describing a setting with different meaning, thinking back to what we were talking about, setting as having character. So write a scene describing standing at a busy intersection of roads. Choose the roads wherever you want, ideally somewhere you know. Describe everything that is going on. Is there anyone in particular you're looking at? What's the weather like? Are there traffic lights? Is there a lot of traffic? Let the reader know that it's all happening today through the things that you describe. Are people on their phones? There's ways of showing that it's today. Now describe the same intersection of roads set in 1880. Again, think about the detail and describe what you see. And if you want to research to see what it would look like, what would have been there, what with their buildings, whether the same buildings, were they different buildings? Was it a farm at that time? Think about all of that context. Describe a classroom from two different perspectives. One, seen by a child who is bored and very anxious for the class to be over. The second, from a child who is enjoying their favorite lesson of the week with their favorite teacher. Describe the child in the classroom. What is the child seeing? How does the child look at the space? Are they looking with relish at what's being written on the blackboard, or are they just seeing scribble on that blackboard? I remember distinctly seeing when I was doing maths when I was little, having absolutely no idea what was going on in there and staring out of the window thinking, this will be over soon and I will be able to get out of here. And if I never learn to count, I really don't care. Or describe a visit to a market. Think of the sights, the smells, the sounds. What does your character feel about being in that space? What are they looking for? Are they excited? Are they frightened? Are they lost? Are they going to buy food? Have they just got some money and they're really delighted that they're going to be able to buy food and go home and cook a great big meal for everybody? And then you don't have to do all of these. You can do one or two, and absolutely whatever you feel like. Describe a forest from the following perspectives. So it's the same forest. One, a child is lost. How does the forest appear? Two, a child is hiding. Three, a child is gathering fruits and foods. Use the forest to set the mood. So the idea really here is to practice how setting is part of a story, that a story is more than the passage of a character through a range of actions. That character exists in the world. How do we create the world? What do we see? And then dialogue. Create a conversation between two friends who are trying to arrange where to meet. Use the dialogue to create a sense of their different personalities and explore the possibility that one of them may be happier about the meeting than the other. Create two pieces of dialogue between a mother and child, with them negotiating over a bedtime. Show different emotions and moods in the two pieces. So think of two different scenarios with a mother and child. How's it going? What's happening? What are they doing? What are they sharing? Are they angry with each other? Are they happy? Are they cuddling? Are they reading a book? Is she desperate to get the child to sleep for any reason? And is the child desperate to stay awake for any reason? And have them show the reader through the dialogue, the way that they're talking to one another. There's lots and lots of fun to be had from just writing. Just think about how you use words, how you drop words, how you show emotion, how you give a sense of character, what kind of character traits are shown through the use of language. We've talked a lot about using dialects and other languages. Use all the things that we've talked about today and think about how to include them in these exercises. next week, after we finish this, the 3 weeks, we will set some more writing exercises which might be helpful to people, just as practice. Something I cannot say enough is that writing is a craft, and through practice we get better at it. Like everything, it's a learned skill, and there's an innate talent and there's an innate desire to tell a story, but through practicing and practicing and practicing, we get better at it. It is like a muscle, and it's kept fit and well through work. So exercises, things that we can do to practice that writing skill can only be helpful. And it doesn't have to be related to anything that you're writing. It doesn't have to be related to a novel that you're trying to write or anything that you're trying to finish. Just choose at random a writing exercise and just do it, because it loosens up your ability and skill just to do writing exercises. So I am putting together a little list of things which we'll share next week and on email. So I think that's it, unless there's any more questions. Let me see if I can now get out of screen sharing. And see, let me see. Okay. All right. So, Debbie, are you there? We're finished, I think. It's midday. Let everybody go and have lunch or all the other things that we want to do today. Thank you very much, everybody, for putting up with my monologue for the last 2 hours. I hope it's been useful, and I hope that you know, the writing exercises are helpful.
Thanks. Thanks for joining us, guys. Same time next week is our final session, so we hope to see you then. And we did see the comment to send the writing exercises. We weren't able to do that for the first one, but this week, fingers crossed that we should get this out on time to you guys.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Next week, we're going to look at plot and point of view, and also a little bit about self-editing. Okay, goodbye, everybody. Take care. Have a lovely week.
Bye-bye.